These are the 15 films that lost Hollywood somewhere between $150 and $200 million in a single year, and adjusted for inflation, that figure climbs to nearly $500 million in 2025 money. This is the story of 1987, the year that broke studios, ended careers, and produced some of the most legendary disasters in cinema history. Most people have never even heard of Rent-A-Cop, and that's what makes it the perfect place to start our countdown. Burt Reynolds and Liza Minnelli headlined this action thriller, a pairing that should have delivered a guaranteed hit, but what actually happened ranks among the most complete box office vanishing acts Hollywood has ever seen. Reynolds had fallen a long way from his days as America's #1 box office draw by 1987, though his $3 million salary suggested somebody still believed in him. The premise cast him as a Chicago cop turned security guard who teams up with a witness to track down criminals, and the studio figured pairing him with Academy Award winner Liza Minnelli would generate sparks. That bet failed spectacularly. International theaters got the film in late 1987 before it limped into American cinemas in January 1988 with virtually no marketing support behind it. The domestic box office total came in under $300,000, which is not a typo. A $12 to $16 million production starring two major names couldn't even crack $500,000 in ticket sales, meaning the gross amounted to less than Reynolds' salary by a factor of 10. The New York Times offered faint praise for Minnelli while calling the plot sloppy and the direction uninspired, and critics elsewhere proved equally brutal. Minnelli took home the Golden Raspberry Award for Worst Actress. The film sits at 14% on Rotten Tomatoes, and no cult following has ever materialized. When your movie earns less than your star's salary by a factor of 10, something has gone terribly wrong. Rent-A-Cop remains completely forgotten except when people discuss career low points for once-beloved stars, having lost an estimated $15 million or more, making it the perfect obscure disaster to begin our countdown. Pinocchio and the Emperor of the Night spent more money fighting Disney in court than it did on actual animation, which tells you everything about how this holiday disaster came together. The voice cast featured James Earl Jones, Tom Bosley, Ed Asner, and Don Knotts, an impressive lineup that couldn't save the film from what came next. The story picks up 1 year after Pinocchio became a real boy, following him as con artists trick him, and he encounters the sinister Emperor of the Night, a demonic figure who rules a nightmare carnival and transforms him back into a puppet. Darker than you'd expect from a children's film, and that darkness would become its only claim to fame. Disney sued Filmation for copyright infringement the moment they learned about the project, but here's the thing. Pinocchio actually exists in the public domain. Filmation won the lawsuit, but legal costs ate through the budget until it ballooned to around $10 million, with roughly half going toward lawyers rather than animators. Janet Maslin of the New York Times called it Saturday morning animation at best, and Charles Solomon of the Los Angeles Times went even harder. Christmas Day 1987 brought the film to over 1,100 screens, where it debuted at number 16, and immediately cratered to a total domestic gross of just $3.26 million. That translates to an estimated loss of nearly $7 million, and no proper North American DVD release has ever materialized. The nightmare sequence where Pinocchio transforms back into a puppet traumatized a generation of children, which has earned it a small devoted cult following for its genuinely disturbing imagery. Made in Heaven tested poorly with audiences and never recovered. A romantic fantasy directed by Alan Rudolph that stars Timothy Hutton and Kelly McGillis in a love story spanning both heaven and earth. Deborah Winger shows up uncredited, and rock stars Tom Petty, Neil Young, and Rick Ocasek all make cameos, giving the film an unusual pedigree that couldn't translate into tickets sold. The premise reaches for something ambitious, following a man who passes away heroically and falls in love with an unborn soul in heaven. When she's sent to Earth to be born, he follows her down, giving up all his afterlife memories to find her again in the living world. Exactly the kind of high-concept romance that could have worked with the right execution. Production started with an $18 million budget that eventually shrank to $13 million, and test screenings turned disastrous. Lorimar demanded reshoots to fix the problems, but director Alan Rudolph refused, leaving behind a film that couldn't decide what it wanted to be. Philosophical musings about reincarnation confused audiences expecting a straightforward love story. Roger Ebert gave it 2 out of 4 stars, praising the heaven sequences as original and spellbinding while noting there was nothing new to say about Earth, and the film currently sits at 56% on Rotten Tomatoes, which sounds respectable until you realize mediocre reviews don't sell tickets. Just under 900 screens carried Made in Heaven to approximately $4.5 million worldwide against its $13 million budget, translating to an estimated loss of $8 to $9 million. The rock star cameos remain its most interesting footnote, making it a curiosity for music fans, but even that couldn't save it from obscurity, leaving it largely forgotten in discussions of 1980s fantasy films. Amazing Grace and Chuck had its heart in the right place and its head somewhere else entirely, a drama directed by Mike Newell that stars Jamie Lee Curtis, Gregory Peck, and William Peterson alongside real-life NBA player Alex English. The plot asks you to accept quite a bit. A 12-year-old Little League pitcher visits a nuclear missile silo and becomes so disturbed by what he sees that he refuses to play baseball until nuclear weapons are eliminated. And somehow his protest inspires an NBA star nicknamed Amazing Grace to quit basketball in solidarity. This triggers a global athlete boycott that eventually forces superpower negotiations on nuclear disarmament, a premise that critics found just as implausible as it sounds. The Department of Defense actively opposed the film, with Assistant Secretary Robert Sims writing a memo objecting to the script and the military denying access to filming at their sites. That anti-establishment stance might have earned credibility with certain audiences, but the film released just 1 month before Gorbachev announced perestroika, making its fears feel slightly dated almost immediately. $5 million covered the production budget, with Jamie Lee Curtis and William Peterson both working for scale because they believed in the message. Gregory Peck showed such commitment that when Prince malfunctioned on opening weekend, he personally drove film canisters to a theater to ensure the movie could be shown, though none of that dedication pushed box office earnings past approximately $4 million. The 43% Rotten Tomatoes score reflects critics finding it well-intentioned but overly sentimental, and the estimated loss of $1 to $4 million makes it one of the smaller disasters on our list, largely forgotten today, except when occasionally shown in schools as an anti-nuclear message film. The timing proved particularly unfortunate as global politics shifted dramatically just weeks after the film's release, leaving its central anxieties feeling like relics of a rapidly changing world. 3 O'Clock High represents a different kind of disaster, the film that deserved so much better than it got, produced by Steven Spielberg's Amblin Entertainment and directed by 22-year-old Phil Joannou. Critics praised this teen thriller, but audiences never showed up. The premise works beautifully in its simplicity, following a nerdy high school journalist who accidentally touches a new student's chest while trying to interview him for the school paper. This new student happens to be a notorious bully with a frightening reputation, and he challenges our hero to a fight at 3 o'clock that afternoon, sending him on a desperate day-long mission to escape his fate through bribing teachers, hiring muscle, and even trying to get himself expelled. Critics praised the stylish direction and Hitchcockian tension, and at just 22 years old, Phil Joannou demonstrated a visual confidence that made this one of the youngest directed studio films of the era. The problem was that nobody knew the movie existed, because by 1987, the Amblin brand was showing signs of fatigue after years of Spielberg-adjacent productions flooding the market. Limited marketing left 3 O'Clock High opening against stiff competition, including Fatal Attraction and The Princess Bride, resulting in a domestic gross of just $3.5 million against an estimated $6 million budget. Here's where this entry differs from most on our list, because 3 O'Clock High has developed a significant cult following over the years and now regularly appears on lists of the best teen movies you've never seen, considered a genuinely underrated gem of the decade. The stylish filmmaking that critics praised in 1987 has only aged better with time, attracting new generations of viewers who discover it through streaming and home video. Box office disaster doesn't always reflect quality, and sometimes it just comes down to bad luck and bad timing. Tough Guys Don't Dance shows what happens when you give a Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist complete creative control over a film adaptation of his own work, and the result stands as one of the most gloriously bizarre disasters of 1987. Norman Mailer directed this one himself, with Francis Ford Coppola serving as executive producer. Ryan O'Neal stars as a writer dealing with alcoholic blackouts who wakes one morning to discover blood in his car, a fresh tattoo he doesn't remember getting, and some very disturbing evidence hidden in his marijuana stash, forcing him to piece together what happened during his lost nights while navigating a cast of eccentric characters played by Isabella Rossellini, Wings Hauser, and Lawrence Tierney. $5 million bought dialogue so overwrought and purple that it crossed from serious noir into unintentional comedy, with tonal shifts between intense drama and campy melodrama, leaving audiences unsure whether to laugh or gasp. Norman Mailer won a Razzie for Worst Director, tying with Elaine May for Ishtar, and the film earned just $858,000 domestically, for an estimated loss of over $4 million. Warren Beatty was originally considered for the lead role, which makes you wonder how different things might have turned out. One particular line reading, where Ryan O'Neal screams a certain exclamation of shock and disbelief, became an infamous internet meme decades later, and the film features an early score by Angelo Badalamenti, who would go on to compose the iconic music for Twin Peaks. Cult label Vinegar Syndrome released Tough Guys Don't Dance on Blu-ray in 2021, cementing its status as a so bad it's good classic, because sometimes the films that fail hardest find the strangest afterlives. The Sicilian represents the continuing curse of director Michael Cimino, who couldn't escape the shadow of Heaven's Gate no matter how hard he tried. $16.5 million went into this epic based on Mario Puzo's novel, a film that should have been a prestige picture but became another chapter in one of Hollywood's saddest career declines. Christopher Lambert stars as real-life Sicilian bandit Salvatore Giuliano, who attempted to liberate post-war Sicily from Italian rule while styling himself as a Robin Hood figure, supported by Terence Stamp, John Turturro, and Joss Ackland in a cast that sounds compelling on paper. Execution turned it into a mess. Problems started with casting because Christopher Lambert is French, but marketing tried to position him as Italian-American, creating immediate confusion. Legal issues compounded everything when it emerged that Mario Puzo's novel connected Giuliano's story to the Godfather universe, but Paramount owned the rights to Michael Corleone, meaning every reference to the Godfather had to be removed, gutting the connection that made the source material compelling. Cimino and the studio battled constantly over runtime until the studio cut more than 30 minutes without his involvement following a legal fight, while Gore Vidal did uncredited script work and later sued for credit. Actual Sicilian mafia members controlled some filming locations and disrupted production. Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel gave it 2 thumbs down, Leonard Maltin rated it a complete failure, and the film earned just $5.4 million against its $16.5 million budget, for an estimated loss of around $11 million. A 149-minute director's cut exists with slightly better reviews, but The Sicilian remains largely forgotten as another casualty of the post-Heaven's Gate Cimino curse. Near Dark stands as the rare entry on this list where the box office failure feels almost criminal in retrospect. A vampire western horror film directed by Kathryn Bigelow that's now considered one of the best genre films ever made. Almost nobody saw it in 1987. Adrian Pasdar stars as a young Oklahoma farm boy who falls for a mysterious woman played by Jenny Wright, and she turns out to be part of a nomadic vampire family traveling the American Southwest, living out of an RV and surviving night to night. Lance Henriksen, Bill Paxton, and Jeanette Goldstein round out the supporting cast, 3 actors who had appeared together in Aliens just the year before. $5 million produced something notable for what it doesn't do, because the word vampire is never spoken in the entire film. Gothic castles and capes gave way to something uniquely American, blending horror with Western imagery in ways that felt genuinely fresh. Critics agreed, pushing Near Dark to 83% on Rotten Tomatoes, with praise calling it one of the best modern-era vampire films. What killed it at the box office comes down to one word: timing. Warner Brothers released The Lost Boys just months earlier with massive marketing muscle, opening on over 1,500 screens, while Near Dark landed through the struggling De Laurentiis Entertainment Group on just 262 screens. $3.4 million against a $5 million budget meant an estimated loss of $1.6 million, relatively small compared to others on this list. But the real story came afterward. Near Dark became a major cult classic, frequently cited alongside The Lost Boys and Let the Right One In as genre-defining, and director Kathryn Bigelow went on to win the Academy Award for Best Director for The Hurt Locker. Box office failure and quality have nothing to do with each other. Fatal Beauty was Whoopi Goldberg's attempt to become an action star, and it didn't work. Director Tom Holland, coming off the successful Fright Night, cast Goldberg as narcotics detective Rita Rizzoli, who uses elaborate disguises to go undercover while tracking dangerous criminals across Los Angeles. The $2 million salary Goldberg received suggested the studio had high hopes, with Sam Elliott, Ruben Blades, and Brad Dourif filling out the supporting cast. Problems became apparent almost immediately when critics saw Fatal Beauty as a transparent Beverly Hills Cop ripoff with a female lead, a comparison made especially obvious by the decision to use the same composer, Harold Faltermeyer, who had created Eddie Murphy's iconic theme. Behind the scenes, a romantic scene between Goldberg and Sam Elliott was allegedly filmed, but cut due to anxieties about interracial romance on screen, and the film initially received a very restrictive rating for its content before an appeal allowed for wider release. Production chaos included Secret Service agents mistaking a scene being filmed as a real robbery, resulting in law enforcement storming the set. Leonard Maltin called it inexcusably awful, and director Tom Holland later called it a mistake, pushing the Rotten Tomatoes score down to 18%, though Roger Ebert proved more generous with 3 stars. $12 million in domestic earnings sounds respectable until you factor in production and marketing costs against an estimated $12 to $15 million budget, leaving the film with moderate losses somewhere in the range of $3 to $8 million. This marked Goldberg's 3rd consecutive underperforming film after Jumpin' Jack Flash and Burglar, a streak that effectively ended her action star ambitions. She'd eventually find her niche in very different kinds of roles, but Fatal Beauty remains an obscure footnote, occasionally noted only when discussing Whoopi Goldberg's failed attempt at action stardom. Who's That Girl proved that Madonna's massive musical success would not translate to the big screen, marking her 2nd consecutive film disaster following Shanghai Surprise in 1986, and demonstrating definitively that she lacked the comedic timing and screen presence to carry a movie. Madonna stars as a street-smart woman wrongly imprisoned who, upon release, enlists a hapless tax lawyer played by Griffin Dunne to help catch the actual perpetrators, while he's supposed to be escorting her out of town, attempting to recreate classic screwball comedies like Bringing Up Baby, complete with a scene where Madonna drags a live cougar through Manhattan. Director James Foley knew trouble was coming and later admitted he knew the film was doomed before filming even started, despite a budget running between $17 and $20 million and heavy promotional investment from Warner Brothers. None of it mattered when opening weekend arrived. A Disney re-release of Snow White outpaced Who's That Girl at the box office, meaning a new Madonna vehicle couldn't beat a 50-year-old animated film. Ticket sales dropped 60% after the first weekend, leaving the film with 7.3 million domestically and around 19 million worldwide against its substantial budget for an estimated loss of 10 to 12 million. Madonna won the Razzie for Worst Actress while the film picked up nominations for Worst Picture, Worst Director, Worst Screenplay, and Worst Original Song, landing at 18% on Rotten Tomatoes. The fascinating part is what happened with the music. The soundtrack sold over 6 million copies worldwide, the title song reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100, and the accompanying Who's That Girl World Tour grossed $25 million successfully. Madonna's musical brand remained completely untouched by her film failures, leaving the movie largely forgotten, while the soundtrack continues to be celebrated. Superman 4 represents the moment when budget cuts visibly destroyed a beloved franchise, becoming a cautionary tale about what happens when financial desperation meets creative ambition and finances win. Christopher Reeve returned as the Man of Steel alongside Gene Hackman, Margot Kidder, John Cryer, and Mariel Hemingway, facing off against Nuclear Man, a creature Lex Luthor creates using Superman's DNA. The plot involves Superman deciding to rid the world of nuclear weapons by collecting all warheads and hurling them into the sun. Cannon Films handled production, and they were in serious financial trouble. $36 million had been the original budget, but just before filming started, Cannon slashed it to $17 million, siphoning funds to other projects in a desperate attempt to stay afloat. The results showed up on screen in ways nobody could miss. Wires became visible during flying sequences, the same shots repeated throughout the film, and the villain looked like a discount He-Man. 45 minutes of footage got deleted after negative test screenings, creating massive plot holes that made the theatrical cut nearly incoherent, while filming locations in England, including Milton Keynes train station, stood in unconvincingly for New York City. Christopher Reeve had co-written the story in exchange for creative control and a large salary, and he later called the film a catastrophe from start to finish in his autobiography. 12% on Rotten Tomatoes made it widely considered the worst Superman film ever made, with domestic earnings of $15.7 million, and worldwide totals of $30.3 million against the $17 million budget. Marketing costs pushed the estimated loss between $10 and $15 million or more. But the bigger damage came to the franchise itself, which ended for 19 years until Superman Returns in 2006. Masters of the Universe was Cannon Films' most expensive production ever, and it nearly bankrupted them when it failed. The popular He-Man toys and animated series should have guaranteed a hit with built-in audience awareness, but the film became a symbol of everything wrong with 1980s toy-based filmmaking. Dolph Lundgren stars as He-Man opposite Frank Langella's villainous Skeletor, with Meg Foster, a young Courtney Cox, and Billy Barty filling out the cast. $22 million represented an enormous budget for Cannon, a company that typically made films for a fraction of that cost. Timing created the first problem because the He-Man toy line and cartoon had peaked in popularity before production even started, meaning kids had moved on by the time the film reached theaters. The script created the second problem by setting most of the action on Earth, specifically suburban California, rather than the planet Eternia, while major characters from the cartoon like Prince Adam and Orko stayed completely absent. Production crisis followed when Cannon's cash flow problems caused filming to actually shut down 3 days before completion, with the climactic battle between He-Man and Skeletor still not filmed. Director Gary Goddard personally financed completion of the final sequence, using only Lundgren and Langella with a skeleton crew, and relying on darkness to hide the minimal production values. Staff had put lens caps on cameras during earlier payment disputes when Mattel didn't pay their half of the production budget on time. Variety called it a Conan Star Wars hybrid ripoff and a colossal bore, landing it at 21% on Rotten Tomatoes. Though Frank Langella's Skeletor performance was consistently praised and remains beloved to this day, his delivery and commitment elevating scenes that had no business working. $17.3 million domestically against the $22 million budget translated to an estimated loss of $15 to $20 million including marketing, and when Cannon couldn't pay Mattel's royalties for a sequel, the sets and costumes got repurposed for Jean-Claude Van Damme's Cyborg in 1989. A strong cult following has developed since, and the post-credits scene showing Skeletor emerging from liquid declaring he'll be back is now considered ahead of its time, with a new reboot scheduled for June 2026. Over the Top shows what happens when a studio throws an obscene amount of money at a star hoping to manufacture a hit. Sylvester Stallone collected $12 million, a record at the time, to make a movie about arm wrestling, and the result was a financial disaster that didn't even earn enough domestically to cover his salary. Stallone plays Lincoln Hawk, a long-haul truck driver and arm wrestler trying to reconnect with his estranged son during a cross-country trip. And after his ex-wife passes away, he must compete in the World Arm Wrestling Championship in Las Vegas to win custody from his wealthy father-in-law. Rocky with arm wrestling was clearly the goal, complete with underdog triumph and inspirational training montages. Director Menahem Golan, who co-owned Cannon Films, reportedly kept offering Stallone more and more money until the star finally agreed, and Stallone later admitted the situation caught him at a weak moment, saying there was a lot of money involved and he figured no one would see it anyway. $25 million bought a film that critics called virtually a feature-length music video with excessive rock songs. Roger Ebert identified the core problem succinctly. Arm wrestling does not have the speed and poetry of boxing or any other sport. 32% on Rotten Tomatoes tells the critical story, though a B+ cinema score suggests audiences who actually saw it proved more forgiving. One genuinely interesting footnote involves the real, over-the-top arm wrestling tournament organized alongside production, the biggest event in arm wrestling history. John Brzenk won the grand prize, a Volvo white semi-truck worth $250,000, with footage from the actual competition integrated into the film, and the plexiglass arm wrestling table from the movie is now a collector's item listed at $35,000. $16 million domestically meant the gross didn't even cover Stallone's paycheck, with worldwide performance proving similarly disappointing. Combined with marketing costs, Over the Top lost an estimated $20 to $30 million across all parties, though the film is now embraced ironically as peak 1980s excess, and the Sammy Hagar soundtrack remains fondly remembered. Leonard Part 6 holds a unique distinction in cinema history. Its own star told audiences not to see it. Bill Cosby, who collected $6 million while serving as both producer and story writer, publicly disowned the film before it even opened, an unprecedented act of self-sabotage that couldn't save audiences from what critics called one of the worst films ever made. The premise defies description, though here's the attempt. Leonard Parker is a retired CIA agent called out of retirement to battle an evil vegetarian named Medusa Johnson, who plans to take over the world using mind-controlled animals, featuring attacks by what can only be described as weaponized meat products, assault by lobsters, and a climactic escape on an ostrich. $24 million covered the budget, including $5 million for marketing, but the incoherent script delivered unfunny jokes, blatant Coca-Cola product placement, and a premise so bizarre that no amount of star power could salvage it. Cineplex Odeon Theaters actually refused to screen it in retaliation for Columbia's distribution decisions on another film entirely, limiting availability from day one. 7% on Rotten Tomatoes stands as one of the lowest scores for any major studio release. Roger Ebert called it one of the worst movies of the year, while Gene Siskel gave it 0 stars and declared it the year's worst film involving a major star, specifically noting it was worse than Ishtar. 3 Golden Raspberry Awards followed: Worst Picture, Worst Actor for Cosby, and Worst Screenplay. Cosby famously accepted his Razzies in person on The Late Show, joking that he swept the awards and requesting they be made of 24-karat gold and Italian marble. The title comes from a weak joke suggesting Leonard's first 5 adventures were classified, and the film runs just 85 minutes, suggesting even the studio knew they couldn't sustain the premise any longer. Reports indicate Cosby tried to buy television rights to suppress it, though the film aired on CBS in 1990 anyway. $4.6 million against the $24 million production budget translates to an estimated loss of $19 to $20 million. And unlike other films on this list, no critical reappraisal or cult following has ever materialized. Ishtar isn't just a box office disaster, it became the very definition of Hollywood failure. A punchline so famous that people who never saw it know its reputation. Directed by Elaine May and starring Warren Beatty and Dustin Hoffman, this adventure comedy lost an estimated $40 to $60 million, roughly $115 to $170 million in today's money, serving as shorthand for catastrophic filmmaking for decades. But here's the twist: it might actually be pretty good. The premise pays loving homage to the Bob Hope and Bing Crosby Road to Pictures, with Beatty and Hoffman playing Chuck Clark and Lyle Rogers, talentless singer-songwriters who dream of being the next Simon and Garfunkel despite having no actual talent. Their agent books them at a hotel in Marrakesh, Morocco, where they stumble into a Cold War standoff involving the CIA, the emir of the fictional nation of Ishtar, and left-wing guerrillas. $27.5 million covered the initial budget, but final costs landed somewhere between $51 and $55 million, plus another $20 million in marketing. What happened to cause that explosion covers nearly every production nightmare imaginable. Coca-Cola, which owned Columbia Pictures, had frozen assets in Morocco that could only be spent locally, forcing extensive location shooting in conditions that created constant problems. Director Elaine May shot scenes twice, once her way and once Beatty's way, generating 108 hours of raw footage, approximately 3 times what a typical comedy would produce, with 3 separate editing teams working simultaneously, one each for Beatty, Hoffman, and May. Production stories became legendary. May reportedly had crews spend weeks scouting for perfect sand dunes, then demanded a flat desert instead, taking 10 days to level a square mile of sand. An animal trainer found a perfect blue-eyed camel but didn't buy it immediately, hoping to negotiate a better price, and when he returned, the owner had eaten the camel. May shot 50 takes of vultures landing in one sequence and was nearly fired during battle scenes, at one point telling Beatty that if he wanted it done, he could shoot it himself. Studio leadership changed during production when David Putnam, who replaced the executive who greenlit Ishtar, arrived after publicly feuding with both Beatty and Hoffman. Negative stories allegedly leaked to the press, and a damaging New York Magazine piece published 2 months before release poisoned expectations before anyone had seen a frame. Roger Ebert gave it half a star and called it truly dreadful, while Siskel and Ebert named it the #1 worst film of 1987. May won the Razzie for Worst Director, tying with Norman Mailer, landing the film at 40% on Rotten Tomatoes, though notably Janet Maslin of the New York Times called it a likable, good-humored hybrid. $14.4 million worldwide turned Ishtar into a punchline everywhere. Gary Larson drew a Far Side cartoon depicting Hell's Video Store filled only with copies of Ishtar, and Kevin Costner's troubled production Waterworld was nicknamed Ishtar by the press. Something strange happened over time, though, as people actually watched the movie. Martin Scorsese called it one of his favorite films of all time. Quentin Tarantino performed songs from the film before private screenings. Richard Brody of The New Yorker called it a wrongly maligned masterwork, and Edgar Wright, Lena Dunham, and Richard Linklater have all publicly defended it. 2 votes in the 2022 Sight and Sound Greatest Films of All Time poll confirmed the reappraisal was real. Gary Larson eventually watched Ishtar and apologized for his cartoon, admitting he'd been entertained, and a Blu-ray director's cut arrived in 2013. Elaine May herself noted that if half the people who made cracks about Ishtar had actually seen it, she would be a rich woman. Ishtar remains the definitive Hollywood disaster by the numbers, but its legacy has transformed from laughingstock to misunderstood comedy, with the film that defined failure for a generation slowly being recognized as something that might have been pretty funny all along. 15 films lost Hollywood somewhere between $150 and $200 million in 1987 alone, approaching $500 million in today's money, vanishing into thin air over 12 catastrophic months. Canon Films' collapse shows what happens when a studio bets everything on franchises and stars without having the resources to support them, because Over the Top, Superman 4, and Masters of the Universe weren't just individual failures. They were symptoms of a company in desperate trouble making increasingly desperate choices, and by 1988, SEC investigations would follow with bankruptcy looming. Star power proved no guarantee either. Bill Cosby, Madonna, Burt Reynolds, Sylvester Stallone, Warren Beatty, and Dustin Hoffman all had films on this list. Some of the biggest names in Hollywood unable to save projects that were fundamentally broken, while films with smaller names and budgets like Near Dark would eventually find the audiences they deserved. Timing mattered enormously across all these disasters. Near Dark might have succeeded in a world without the Lost Boys. 3 O'Clock High might have found an audience without competing against Fatal Attraction, and Superman I-4 might have worked with its original $36 million budget instead of the slashed $17 million. Small decisions and market conditions can determine whether a film becomes a hit or a disaster. Box office failure isn't always the final word either. Near Dark is now a classic, 3 O'Clock High gets rediscovered regularly, and Tough Guys Don't Dance found its audience decades later as an ironic cult favorite. Ishtar, the very definition of Hollywood failure, has been reevaluated and championed by some of cinema's most respected voices. $3.91 covered the average ticket price in 1987, yet these films found ways to lose tens of millions each. Some were genuinely terrible, some were ahead of their time, some were good films that simply couldn't find their audience, and some, like Ishtar, might have been good films that were never given a fair chance. 1987 broke studios, ended careers, and produced legends of failure that we're still discussing nearly 4 decades later, while hits like Beverly Hills Cop 2, Fatal Attraction, and 3 Men and a Baby were raking in over $150 million each. These 15 disasters were burning through studio budgets at an alarming rate, and the contrast couldn't be starker. The line between success and catastrophe in Hollywood can be razor thin. A camel gets eaten, a budget gets slashed, a studio changes leadership, and suddenly you're not making a hit anymore. You're making history of a very different kind. Studios typically needed a film to gross 2 to 2.5 times its production budget just to break even after marketing and distribution costs, and most of these films couldn't even manage half that ratio. The legacy of 1987's disasters shaped Hollywood for decades to come, making studios more cautious about runaway productions, while the independent exploitation studio model that Canon represented essentially collapsed. Several of these films eventually found the audiences they deserved on home video, proving that box office failure isn't always the final word on a film's worth.